Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Kelly Starrett and Brent Brookbush. I feel like these two need no introduction because they are absolutely iconic. They are legends in the space of performance and rehabilitation. Today, the three of us are going to be diving into this concept of if there is a best approach to rehabilitation. Is there a best approach to physical therapy, physical rehabilitation that way? I think we take this conversation in a direction that's a little different than most people might think. This is probably one of the best episodes that I've ever recorded, and I highly recommend you listen to it and share this with a friend who could benefit from listening to it as well. Episodes like this are made possible by our sponsors, ISOFIT and Oro Muscles. For more on ISOFIT and Oro, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Kelly, Brent, welcome back to the podcast. I know we've had both of you on separately before and had some amazing discussions, and I'm excited to bring both of you kind of back on together this time. I really appreciate your time. And, like we were talking about, I feel like you two don't really need an introduction. I mean, Kelly is kind of the father of performance physical therapy, at least in my opinion. And like I mentioned, Brent, I view you as like the human version of artificial intelligence at this point. The way you're able to process so much information and insight on the day-to-day is just remarkable that way. But, maybe there's someone out there who hasn't heard of the two of you. Would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the great stuff that you guys do?
Not it. You go first.
I'm going first. Obviously, you guys know I'm trainer, physical therapist as far as like credentialing goes, but I've spent the last 20 plus years in education. So between doing training and development for some of the largest sports clubs and then, a certification company, and then of course building the Brookbush Institute and trying to solve so many of the problems that I basically fell upon when I was going through being an educator for other companies, right? So, and now just trying to address even somewhat problematic issues in education now. It's like, you guys know my whole life is dedicated to how do I get education better? How do I get us better information? How do I get it delivered better? How do I get it more affordable? How do I get it more accessible? Like it's the nonstop grind.
I don't know how to even follow that. So I want to point out something that you just said. You introduced yourself as a trainer first and then a physio second. And I want to echo that myself, is that I'm a coach first and foremost. In fact, my world has even drifted further into what I'll call a high performance model, where we have a director of high performance. Even though I'm trained as a physical therapist, I come into organizations and really take a systems approach to where we think we have opportunity, where we have agency, where we can shift loci of control back to the person. And that might be talking about nutrition or sleep or community or belonging or missing hip extension. And more importantly, something that you also hit on, which I just want to double click on, is the decentralization. And you have moved of information and tactics. You have moved so much, Brent, outside of the purview of this is siloed and held by institutions. And I don't mean to sound like big conspiracy, but what you said is, hey, I think these tools and tactics and understanding and learning and education can belong to you. We can democratize this information. There's always going to be a role for an expert who's highly trained, but what we want to do is move as much unskilled information from behind this paywall so that people can sort of take a crack at it themselves. And the reason I sort of ended up on the same thing, I'm not necessarily in the education place, but we saw that the treatment table was way too far away from the squat rack, way too far away from the field of play. And so what we were seeing was that we were trying to cram sort of problems that could have been addressed, whether it been nutrition and hydration or warm up or movement quality or just tissue restriction or inability to access a shape, right? Volume, all of those things. We'd pop these red flags, or not red flags, but we'd pop, early warning signs, right? Pain, loss of performance, et cetera, et cetera. And then we would wait until it got so bad that we would activate the emergency medical system, which would be going to see a physio, going to see a trainer. And what we felt like was, man, there's got to be a better way of working on performance and chasing that performance, working on giving people more movement choice, making movement more tolerable to the brain, giving athletes sort of agency and control, and really looking at when and where they can do these things and who owns what. And then, then sort of bringing the physios to the table by giving them a model for understanding complex movement, especially formal movement in the gym, and then bringing trainers and coaches to the table so that that Venn diagram overlapped a little bit and we created a system. So and then I take a model and I just go ahead and try to break the model every single day in every single environment I can ever find. Oh, you're a water polo player? Great. Let's see how this works. You're a football team. You're the CIA or the FBI or SEAL Team 6. We just try to break the model and see if we can improve people's experience on Earth through movement.
Comes the concept of solving problems through movement at the end of the day. And
it really is.
And it's a complex issue. It's something that we would love to just simplify and boil down and have this like one best approach. And a lot of times I think people argue that it's something outlandish, like, hey, it's all manual therapy only, or hey, all we ever do is dry needle and that's it, or hey, maybe isometric exercise is the only thing we ever have to do, period. When in reality, I think the best approach is going to end up combining all of those things together and then some. And I think one of the many issues that I see in our space is we're all so siloed, to use your term, that we don't ever come together collectively and cohesively. I know you mentioned about the high performance model as an example that way, and I ultimately think that's the direction we all need to go. We all need to kind of come together and be more cohesive and act in the best interest of the person in front of us, right? We're all on the same team. We're all working towards the same goal. How do we get this person from coming in to see us to, walking out our doors and hopefully never coming back because it's never an issue again, right? And I think that the more we all come together collectively and cohesively for that common goal, the better we're going to be. But we have to have the hard discussions like this today. We have to talk about what things are good, what things aren't good, and what kind of formulates that whole best approach. And the more siloed we become and the more, out on our own little islands, we kind of like develop our own approaches, the more we're going to kind of miss that like systematic approach, to use your term that way.
One of the things that, again, I think Brent and I share in common is that we believe in sort of the power of hyperlocality, that a person working with another person, that person understands the available resources, experience, relevant context and background. And so if I come in with my super approach and just lay over my template, I don't understand the community. I don't understand the resources. I don't understand the socioeconomic status. I don't understand the access. But if I can teach a person to have a way of thinking, then they can grab the tools that they're most comfortable with and that they think maybe applies to this person the most effective. And the only thing we really care about, inputs and outputs. Like outcomes should be driving our conversation. And when we empower people to become more sophisticated in their understanding of all of those things, hey, I don't think there's anything wrong with your foot. I think you're super stressed and you ate a bowl of cereal today and that's it. Also, you don't have any dorsiflexion and your tissues are grody, right? How are we going to manage that? And I think that one of the things that, Brent has done such a beautiful job of flipping over these tables is that it turns out that the original model of getting a physician's referral, seeing someone for 45 minutes every 2 weeks, that may just be an insufficient model or system to address the actual needs of what's going on. So maybe we're arguing about a process or a system that we actually need to reject and think, when and where are we giving this information or allying with people to sort of understand their own power? And then how could you possibly argue, like, if you only have 13 minutes to see someone, maybe a PAVM isn't your first option, right? But does that mean that PAVMs are bad or mobilizing a joint yourself is bad so that they can move? But if the whole system is set up that it's going to take 6 weeks to evaluate someone, all you can do is give them a handout, is that skilled care?
Yeah, I mean, you both bring up some really interesting points. Number one, we have to decide that there is a best possible approach. And you guys know I just recently wrote that article that like formalized a proof to demonstrate that mathematically there is a best possible approach.
That's right.
That wasn't to claim that the Brookbush Institute is the best possible approach.
No. In fact, you went out of your way not to do that.
Yeah, it's just to say that, like, and you hit on it just now, Kelly, and I don't even know if you realize it. The first thing people have to try to wrap their head around is that everything we should do should be outcome driven. And then we have to decide what outcomes we're going to go after. And then if we can decide what outcomes we're going to go after, then there has to be most effective interventions for optimizing that outcome, right? Like, because everything has some level of relative efficacy. Some things are more effective than others. We would hope that as a profession, right, that we are trying to prioritize the most effective interventions. Now, of course, inputs to your point, Kelly, can change what are the most effective interventions for that particular subset, right? Which is where assessment should come in, right? Like your assessments should have one goal, and that is to help your decision making in finding the best possible intervention to optimize for the outcomes of the person who's in front of you. And way too many people don't think like this. This gets into like decision theory, right? Like information theory, right? And we need to bring some of that in. That stuff is moving at a rocket ship's pace when it comes to like technology and computer science and how AIs work, right? But then like you get back to our professions and like nobody actually even thinks about decision making and decision trees and what was the most effective choice and how is that going to affect outcomes, right? Like we can't even decide as a profession, do we treat movement or pain? We should all be treating movement, but there are obviously still a lot of individuals out there like trying to chase the pain model, which research already kind of shows is like not the way to go. But there is definitely some choices that we need to make as a profession that really should be made objectively that I don't know as a profession we have all agreed on.
Yeah. I want to open a clinic that just is bourbon and ibuprofen, and I can treat all of your pain very quickly. Little pop-up shop. Dude, come on by. It's going to be hard on your liver, but I guarantee you I can make you feel better for a while.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, wait, we run that experiment with opiates. All right, we ran that experiment. I don't want to cut you off, but I want to double click on the fact that you really pointed out that the scientific method is induction through large data sets to arrive at what we understand are principled decisions. And again, whatever tools you have, stop arguing about the tool, right? Is it the Nike shoe? Is it the Adidas shoe? No, it's the shoe, right? It doesn't matter what shoe you're using as long as you're striking the ball. Just the fact that ultimately we're making a hypothesis and we're testing our hypothesis in a transparent way, and we're feedback that was a terrible decision. What is that feedback mechanism? The feedback mechanism is not the note. The feedback mechanism is, wow, I'm working with friends. Hey, Brent, what you're doing, your outcomes are insane. Let me pay attention to what's doing that. And really, I think what we've lost is this curiosity and just sort of really humble curiosity where like, I think that every day I'm like, there's someone who's doing this better than I am, and I'm going to go find them, and then I'm going to understand their decision-making so that I can replicate that with the people in front of me.
Yeah, I think there's another part of that too, though. Yes, it's humility to the scientific method, right?
That's right. That's what I'm saying.
There's no ego about what I do when I'm treating somebody, right? But there's also the discipline of like, I am always doing this is based on all of the systematic reviews we've done, but like 2 of the assessments I'm going to do with everybody is going to be overhead squat assessment and goniometry. And if I don't get the result that I'm looking for, when I reassess, I need to do something different.
That's right.
Discipline. Unfortunately, I think there's a large amount of complacency in every profession, but in ours, for this particular example, where I see so many professionals who don't assess. And then if they do assess, they don't reassess after performing an intervention. They kind of do one of those like post hoc, how do you feel? Well, as long as you feel better, I'm going to assume that I did the right thing. But it's like, yeah, pain is a very, especially like in the moment subjective pain criteria, like I feel a little better, is so unreliable because you can do almost anything to change pain. You can ice, you can heat, you can rub, you can tell somebody they're a good boy. All of these things will probably have an instant effect on pain, but no effect on long-term outcomes, right? Like we've already shown in the available research that like patient expectation and professional expectations do not impact long-term outcomes, right?
You're splitting already, and I just want to point out to everyone what you just did there around of really trying to pull pain as a subjective and objective measurement, almost putting in its own category. Because you're right, if we're in there to just manage pain, and look, that's a valid reason to go see a professional. I can't go to work today, but there's got to be some underlying mechanism that ultimately we're not we're addressing or not addressing, or we're inadvertently addressing. But I really want to just point out that as soon as I started taking pain out of this equation and really was objective, and again, the two things I measure, biomotor output, range of motion, which is exactly what you did, expression through overhead squat, right? A complex systems approach, and range of motion. I mean, those are the things I can hang my hat on.
Right.
Your pain or how you feel subjectively depends on how much cocaine and steroids you're taking, which is a very effective stack, everyone. Just so you know.
Absolutely.
Always works.
Where do we draw the line on range of motion assessment, though? Because, like, I'm just thinking about, take the shoulder complex. Like, can I just look at glenohumeral and a few different motions and check that box, call it good? Or do I have to go off the deep end and look down at the elbow, look at the neck, look at the scapula? Because as you were kind of outlining earlier, a lot of people are pressed for time in today's day and age, and they want to get the most bang for their buck in the time that they have with someone. And obviously, Brent, I love your overhead squat assessment. That's one of the most common things that I do, because I feel like in a very short amount of time, I get a ton of great information. But I think some of these little things like goniometry, we can really get lost in the sauce, especially in certain areas like wrist and hand. Like, I can't tell you the last time I measured DIP range of motion, but should I be doing that?
Yeah, there's actually a couple.
Depends what sport you're playing, right?
Yeah, that is very true. Maybe if you're a rock climber. But two things that you guys got brought up that is kind of interesting, right? Realize pain, we all want to address patient complaints, right? We're not saying that, like, if somebody comes into pain and we're acting as a physical therapist, not necessarily as a performance coach in this particular example, right? But we're acting as a physical therapist. We know that pain is what we're trying to get rid of. But there's a difference between changing short-term subjective pain and long-term pain, objectively, right? Like, if you fix the pain now, that doesn't necessarily mean you did the best thing for a long-term resolution of pain. And that's all I'm really trying to separate out when I say I'm not going to chase pain in my session. I'm going to chase these movement parameters. To answer your question, Dan, this is related. What we need to be going after are the signs that are most highly correlated with the best possible outcomes, right? So when we get into something like the overhead squat assessment, the reason why I use the overhead squat assessment and continue to use the overhead squat assessment for now 20 years, right, is that I get to see all of the segments all at once and narrow in to whatever segment of the body is exhibiting signs of dysfunction. Now, where do I use goniometry? Well, the problem with the overhead squat assessment is that it is a binary assessment. You either have a sign or you don't, and there's no way to show improvement in an objective way. So then I go back to goniometry, which is a continuous interval measure, for those of you guys who remember your math and science, right? Where I can go, okay, well, for example, if we're talking about like knees bow in, I know knees bow in is coming from ankle, hip, something, right? I'll use some further assessments to figure out which one. Let's say I figure out that knees bow in is primarily being driven by a loss of dorsiflexion, right? Maybe I don't clear up knees bow in one session, but I can use my goniometer to then only measure dorsiflexion as my continuous interval measure so that I can show progress, right? And that's where, like, obviously all of this stuff we're talking about, it's like a systems approach. It's not that you're going to do goniometry for everything. You're just using goniometry as your progress measurement tool based on the correlated sign that you were going after to begin with.
And let me just blow this conversation up for a second, because I love your question. What's important? So the real question here is, if you're coming to see me as a physio and you have shoulder pain or you're of elbow pain, let's take that for example, right? But we know the whole problem is that you have no internal rotation of your shoulder. At what point do I say this is enough for my physical therapy intervention because you're functional enough to do your hair or do your bra or your ADLs? But that has nothing to do with returning that person to full normative power, to have a conversation about what their lifestyle looks like or what interventions are happening in their strength and conditioning. It's almost like we need to have two discrete things. I'm here because this problem prevents me from doing what I need to do with my body or what I want to do with my body, occupy my role in society, my role in my family. So I'm going to see you because I'm getting paid by some third-party payer or out of pocket so I can do my thing. But I haven't solved your problem. I haven't, what is it? Until you can overhead squat with weight and your heart rate's high and you're under metabolic demand and you're going fast and we're competing, that I don't even know if that's a stable system, right? I'm just getting a snapshot of who you are today in this moment with this thing. So the real question is, how much of normative should we be chasing, and restoration of enough function is enough? I mean, is this decent overhead? Well, if I can do my job and my shoulders and hurt, but that is nowhere near complete end range flexion. So I think we need to have a conversation about, like, where is the parameter of enough? Or suddenly it looks like Brent introduced himself as a coach and trainer first. And because what we suddenly see is that the continuum of movement practice, movement development suddenly delves out of, corrective exercise. It delves out of just a simple mobilization into how are we loading and when are you loading, what tools do you have, et cetera. So I think that's a really important sort of way of thinking about this is, again, how much am I going to get done in my 3 sessions, if that's what I have, or my 10 visits, and what am I going to prioritize? And then what then?
Yeah. I think, to your point, Kelly, if you're asking me about everything you just said, right? How much range of motion, how much movement should you try to get back? Well, all of it. The goal.
That's right.
So, am I going to go for 180 degrees of shoulder flexion, 70 degrees of shoulder internal rotation, 95 degrees of shoulder external rotation? Yes. And I can tell you that from my experience, and this is a little bit of a humble brag, I can usually do that in one session. Not because I'm the smartest guy that ever existed, but because I know what to focus on. Because I've taken the time to prioritize, using research, prioritize what are the best interventions, what are the things that I'm going after. Usually, it doesn't always happen that you can get all that stuff back in one session, but a lot of times it does. But then when you were talking about strengthening, when do I do that? Yes, all the time. The goal of every session is self-management. The goal of every session is to walk out with an exercise program. I will refer people to physical therapists, refer people to chiropractors, refer people to athletic trainers, right? Refer people to personal trainers. But I can assure you I will not refer to you if you do one thing wrong right off the bat. If you do not give a home exercise program, I will never refer anybody to you ever. Like, it's just, that line to me is like, if your only goal is to create us as professionals dependence, you have a problem.
Love that.
That's a great point. And ultimately, it comes back to what you mentioned before, Kelly and Brent, about having that kind of overlap between the coaching and the physical therapy side of things. I think a lot of times in the quote unquote rehab space, we don't do a good enough job reverse engineering our outcomes or our goals, I should say. What I mean by that is someone comes in to see us and they don't know when their last session is going to be. Maybe it's when the insurance tells them, or maybe it's when their PT tells them, but they don't know what that end goal looks like. And I think the more we clearly define our end, what that end outcome of everything that we're trying to do is, the better we're able to build a plan to get there. But a lot of times we don't have the ability to set a goal and reverse engineer a plan to get there for whatever reason. And yet that's an area that I think strength and conditioning absolutely crushes. It's like, oh, you want to bench 315 for reps because you're a dude in high school. Like, yeah, absolutely. We can make that happen. We're just going to bench 3 days a week and we'll get you there. Right? Like, we don't have that end in mind mindset the majority of the time. And I think that the more we kind of begin with the end in mind, the better off we're going to be able to build that kind of plan and progression there. I also like your point, Brent, on the importance of the home exercise program. And I think this is an area where, again, Kelly's work has been absolutely phenomenal, because we can literally take nearly anything we do with our hands and give some version of that to our patients at home for them to do. It might not be the exact same as hands-on, but it's still almost the exact same thing. It's comparable. And I think that kind of stuff, the more that they do it and the more they start to take control of their own situation and we promote that autonomy piece, the better off they're going to be. And I think that the more we kind of create that independent line of thinking in this kind of performance and movement space, the better off our entire profession is going to be. You won't be stuck waiting 4 or 5 weeks for a PT appointment anymore, because a lot of people will be able to handle a lot of the things on their own and they just won't have to go to us.
Yeah, I think it's one thing I was going to bring up is, like, I was thinking in the back of my head, right? Like, every personal trainer needs to learn corrective exercise. every physical therapist should really not only learn corrective exercise, because most of our Therex programs were horrible in school,
That's
but
right.
also grab a CPT certification and learn the strength and performance side at some level. But I do think it's kind of ironic that both Kelly and I got known in the industry as corrective exercise guys. That's what that's what like catapulted our little. That's what gave us our little ramp, right? And then of course we got collected. Both of us got known for other things, but like it's kind of funny that we both got kind of known for this like self-administered movement optimization, exercise thing, right? Like that is definitely a bridge that like everybody should really take on, right? It's just an interesting thought, I guess.
That term movement optimization or optimal movement has come up a couple times. And what does that look like to the two of you, right? Is that just full range of motion and wicked strong? Is that like not like compensatory in nature? What is that optimal movement that we're all chasing?
I mean,
I'm so glad you brought this up. Thank you very much. So one of my favorite coaches is a guy named Frans Bosch. He's a Dutch coach, very, very smart. If you look at his programming, it's basically, he looks at all, strength training is basically coordination training with resistance. I really like this sort of model that we want to become, let's put skill in and let's challenge skill with all these novel ways, right? And give you a dumbbell, I give you a barbell, it's open chain, it's closed chain, right? You have to change direction, there's metabolic load, hinted at, cardiorespiratory man, speed load, all of these different ways of just challenging your coordination and your ability to be stable. He has a quote that says there's more variation in waltzing than there is in sprinting. And this is important because at low loads and low speeds and low consequence, you can do anything because your body is so rad. And so what we confuse is it doesn't matter because anything you want to do with your body, you're allowed to do with your body, and it's all good and it's movement optimism, and don't worry. But as soon as we take a step into going fast, repeatedly going fast, my body's on the line, I have to reproduce this high skill, right? This complicated, complex motor pattern for repeatability, then suddenly what we start to see is that, boy, all the practices start to look very homogenous. That the Olympic lifters, I was in Paris, watched the A session for the super heavyweight women, and the difference is the length of their bones, their anthropometry, but the rest of the thing is the same thing. And they all have these different strategies, different fueling, different coaching, different volumes based on their body types. But at the end, really ends up seeing very little variation in the actual movements, maybe some technical things that one school does, but it's pretty much the same. And so what we always point to is what's the highest expression of the movement? What's the most sort of, what's the position of the movement or the expression of the movement that gives us the most choice, right? That allows us to transfer the skills. So we run everything through that pattern. And then that really helps us to say this is why we teach these skills, because we see that they have the greatest transferability and they continue to scale up to the highest levels of human function that we can witness and observe.
Yeah, I mean, right on. Obviously, Kelly, way to throw it in there. I mean, I think Dan, I have some pretty technical definitions when it comes to optimal form and posture, and I can read these off. Like we've been using these for a long time. Optimal posture is optimal arthro and osteokinematic alignment maintained by myofascial activity and length as a result of sensation integration and activation by the nervous system, both statically and dynamically. Now we've moved to what would that look like from a falsifiable, like evidence-based definition, which is where we came up with a mean range of segment alignment that is absent of signs correlated with dysfunction, pain, or increased risk of injury. And that kind of hits on this point of like, we get this like weird stuff, especially on social media right now. Like the movement optimism thing is anything but optimistic, right? It is just a bunch of guys bashing everybody who says anything about knees bow in or an anterior pelvic tilt. Like they're not optimists, they're contrarians. What they seem to fail to realize is there is definitely research and enough evidence to show that like if you have, for example, something like knees bow in during squatting, during running, right? You have that knee valgus, your risk of injury and pain is increased. Now, Could you be one of the people that never experiences knee pain with knee valgus? Of course. Life is probabilistic, not deterministic. And that's
right.
something that we have found out through COVID and many other tests of the population. People don't like to think in probabilities, right? They go, well, I know somebody who has knee valgus and they've never had knee pain, so you're wrong. And it's like, no, that's not how that works. There will always be outliers, right? That's just the way probabilities work. And then I think if we really want to get advanced into this idea of, what does good form look like? What does good movement look like? And what does dysfunction look like? We also have to realize that some signs have a higher correlation with pain and dysfunction than others.
That's right.
For example, an excessive forward lean during a squat is probably going to be more highly correlated with low back pain than an anterior pelvic tilt. Does that mean an anterior pelvic tilt can't contribute to low back pain? No. But it's just to understand that certain signs, feet flattened, for example, are going to have a certain risk of pain and dysfunction. Knee valgus, knee varus, right? Arms falling forward head tilt. Could you have all of these signs and no pain? Sure. I mean, chances are if you had all of them, the chance of you having no pain is probably pretty unlikely.
And let's run that experiment for 20 or 30 years because you own it now.
Exactly. Right.
We need to think in these scales, right?
Right. Because it's really dysfunction times intensity times time, right? Is what leads to your probability of risk, right? So you have knee valgus. Well, how intense are you? Are you doing a 300
low speed, right?
Yeah. Are you doing a 315-pound squat? Are you playing basketball? Or are you just walking around? If you're just walking around, it might take a while for that to develop into anything significant from a pain or symptomology standpoint, right?
I'm sorry about your bunions. There was nothing we could do about it.
Right. 20 years after that dysfunction started, right? Because that's usually when we get to that one. But I was just writing about this in that article, because I've been updating that article we were just talking about of there is a best possible approach, right? And there was this idea of somebody came back to me and it's well, we don't have the research to figure this out. And I'm like, well, here's the problem. Probably, and I think I've said this on a couple other podcasts. I think the biggest disappointment in my entire career is to find out how little of the research people are actually using. And I'm talking about the supposed smartest, most expert people in the industry. A lot of them are just faking it. There is so much research out there that is not being used. And then we see what's going on Instagram and it's yeah, they're saying posture has no influence on pain. Because they don't read research. And if we're being real about this, so few people actually do that you have to be very careful what you're getting from the internet, right?
I want to also point a couple things about in this contrarian approach that we're seeing, right?
Yeah.
Is why do they think that? So I really am trying to be curious again about, hey, there's a group of people who have come to believe that it doesn't matter. Right. How you organize your spine. It's going to affect your cervical rotation. You won't be able to access your pelvic floor and you can't take a big breath and your shoulders don't work as well, but it's fine. Right. Again, notice that I point back towards biomotor output expression. Right. I'm into shapes and positions translated into movement practices and loading that allow us to maintain the most access to our native physiology. Look, I just can't create the same intra-abdominal pressure in an overextended or flexed position. I just can't, right? My erectors don't work when have that huge, they work, but they don't work as well as I'm a more organized, mid-range, more reasonable position for my pelvis. So why did they come to believe this? Is it because the system set up that when I only see people who have pain, it doesn't change my outcomes, or I'm in a model where there's always someone coming in and I'm never responsible for outcomes, or I'm never responsible for performance, that I come to believe that? Or, what I want to be curious about is what are the conditions that led someone to think the way they're thinking, and why is it that we're thinking the way we're thinking? And overlaying that is this really important thing, which I think Brent does a really good job of. It's called transparency. If I go to your site, Brent, I can see how you think, what your rationale is, what the application looks like, and when you actually, where you put your hands and what the outcomes were. Like, you are as transparent as any clinician in the world right now in terms of soup to nuts. This is my thinking. Here's the thought process. Here's my research. Here's the application. So it's not done in a sort of black box where someone says, hey, my technique is the best and your technique is shit. Well, I'm like, well, I need to see what it looked like. Can you show me a session? Can I see what your interventions were? Can I see your person moving? One of the things I learned early on, it was Joe DeFranco earlier, I mean, this is in the early 2000s, started filming his weightlifting sessions with his elite athletes. Like good, bad, ugly, all the bad reps, all the warm-ups, all the crappy mistakes, motor learning cues, and he put it out there. And it was the first time you didn't just see PR, PR, PR. What you saw was, oh my gosh, it is a complicated, messy intervention with constant guide rails and reintervention, reinterpretation. And I really appreciated and took that to heart about, hey, I need to be transparent. I'll show you what I do, and I show you, but until you show me yours, I really can't say that we're comparing anything yet.
Yeah, I mean, to your point too, like the transparency factor, the fact that, you know, we are trying to build every course from a comprehensive review of all of the research, like every research study that's available. And to your point, we've tried to be systematic about it so that, like, even if you don't agree with our conclusion, you can see the research and the outcomes from that research and how we came to that conclusion. It's not like, it's not Brent's opinion, right? Like, I try to keep my opinions out of everything we do, right? Like that's not what we're going for. We're going for outcomes. Like nothing else matters but outcome, right? And we were talking a little bit before this started about that quote. We were talking about Harari, and you were talking about why is this contrarian thing happening? And I think we have a couple contributing factors. Number one, most of these people who are talking about this stuff doesn't matter are young. And why is that a problem? Because of the time and intensity thing we were just talking about. Yeah, it's real easy to get to 22 to 25, maybe even 28 and not have had a serious injury. But if you keep working with knee valgus and you keep putting intensity, it's like all of a sudden in your 30s, you start going, oh, this corrective exercise is pretty cool. And by the time you're in your 40s, that's all you do. Right? Like there's a little bit of the youth thing and not having perspective. But then with the Harari quote we were talking about, where it's like, to come up with the most accurate information is actually really hard.
Yeah.
Accurate information is expensive, right? I was just talking with a coach who I've known for a very long time. He's had a very successful career as the head of strength and development for several NBA teams, right? And we were talking about...
I'm just going to call that decent. That's decent experience.
Yeah, decent experience.
His job is on the line all the time, people.
All the freaking time. So we were talking about, a previous company that we had worked for and the model that they were using and what a great step that was, but how at the end of the day, it was still fairly inaccurate. And what it took for the Brookbush Institute in particular, we were talking about our education platform, is, we've been doing systematic reviews of every acute variable in strength and performance, right? So how much rest between sets, how many sets per exercise, how many reps per set, should you do repetitions to failure, right? Like,
you mean to tell me all those things matter?
Exactly. But you look at like, okay, what did we have to do to take the next step in proving the accuracy of this previous model? Well, it's taken me years and well over 1,000 research studies to slowly pick apart, okay, what is the optimal recommendation for acute variables? That's years of a team working on trying to come up with the most accurate answer, which supports this point of like, yeah, accurate information, it's really hard. I understand why most education companies would never do this, because it's going to be a long-term investment that is going to take a long time to pay back in finance, right? Like, obviously we're a company like anybody else. How do you financially justify the fact that it might take us the next 3 years to improve this model, right? But then, of course, and at the same time, garbage is just being pumped into Instagram every day, right?
Right.
Garbage is just being pumped into TikTok every day. Well, what about this? And what about this? And you're not jacked and your biceps aren't that big. And where's your chest, bro? And I'm like, all right.
We
Well, I mean,
one of the projects we're working on right now is a book on sports and performance for 12 to 18-year-olds, and really shifting the control back to families. How do we make a parent sort of a high performance director for their kids? One of the things that we're in a chapter about is, what does movement training, formal movement training look like? And how is that different than aesthetics and fitness as like hobby? And I think one of the things that I'm having to do a lot more differentiation on is saying, hey, this thing over here is entertainment, and having biceps and abs doesn't actually mean you're healthy. In fact, we have the research to show that, right? That we have a lot of people who are coming in who look jacked, but they're just metabolically deranged, not, hormones are not great. I mean, reds, just like all the things. And what we see is there's a lot of entertainment around aesthetics and body composition. And again, more power to you. I'm as libertarian as it gets when I'm like, you can do whatever you want with your body, but don't pretend that same sort of ethos of I'm jacked and tan, and that's still going to help me win an Olympic medal or help someone develop a pattern or progress a child from 10 to 18 so that then they have these movement and motor building blocks. And I really think that has muddied the water a lot around, again, what I'm going to call formal strength and conditioning, sports preparation training, even a step away from GPP, step away from what I call now fitnessing. I'm like, oh, fitnessing is like entertainment. It's like reading or like crocheting. Like, you just go to the gym. That's your hobby. That's great. But that does not inform us about what best practice is. And that really has muddled the water a little bit.
yeah, I completely agree. And just to kind of hopefully tie a lot of this together, I mean, to your point on education, Brent, at the end of the day, the textbooks that we have learned from for many, many years are not living, breathing documents that get updated every time the model advances. It gets updated every time they need to write a new edition. Whereas in the world of online articles and the type of work and research that you're doing, it's updated every time something new becomes available. So it's living, it's breathing, it changes in relation to all the amazing stuff that we're learning every day. I think it's incredible how fast we're advancing in relation to how much we're learning so quick. And the incorporation of AI, that's only going to fuel it faster.
Not true. Like, you got to be careful with, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm sorry to interrupt. I have to realize, like, I love ChatGPT. We just launched an AI tutor on the Brookbush Institute, but there's a huge difference between the AI tutor on the Brookbush Institute and if you go to ChatGPT. You got to remember that ChatGPT has been trained with publicly available information, right? It does not have access to most research journals, which are behind a paywall. So if you ask it to develop you a physical therapy program or a personal training program, it will do that. It is a generative AI. Its goal is to tell you what it thinks you want to hear. But that information is based on blogs, articles, social media, right? Blogs are not, I have posted this many, many times, hashtag stop education by blog, because blogs follow trends. They don't follow research. Remember what we were just talking about. Accurate information is expensive and hard. Writing a blog article that's controversial and get a lot of attention. You don't need to work on your posture. Posture's bullshit. Boom. Goes viral, right? Completely inaccurate. No evidence to support it, right? Like, maybe it cites a couple other articles, which is not what you're supposed to do with a citation, right? Like, not research studies, but just other articles, right? So realize, like, ChatGPT is built on that.
Yeah.
So unless you're coming into somebody's platform, for example, when we created an AI tutor, the AI tutor on the Brookbush Institute uses our content, right? And we know our content is built on systematic reviews, right? If you're not using a very specific AI, you're not going to get accurate information. I actually saw somebody who I respect a lot make this mistake the other day where he's like, yeah, if I want some medical information, if I want to find out what's happening in medicine and what the best suggestions are, I'll throw it into ChatGPT and ask it for a summary of what's going on in the research. And you go, oh, what a great idea. Only you forget that ChatGPT can't access the research. And since it is a generative AI, it's going to tell you what it thinks you want to hear, which could, by the way, be making up citations, which ChatGPT is known to do because they hallucinate. It has to do with the way these things work. But
It-
yeah, you got to be careful with the AI thing. Like,
I think there was a great article, and I think the Economist, maybe it's the Economist or something, maybe 10 years ago, and it's called "The Death of Expertise," and you can search it. Remember that?
yeah, it was.
And really,
book.
I think
Good book.
it is, and I think one of the problems we're seeing right now is we don't know who is an expert anymore. That's really difficult. When we teach our courses, one of the things I try to help people to do is to help them understand what they're seeing and ask critical questions, right? The thing like, where's the person owning control here? What are the essential positions and shapes that we're trying to change? Again, based on evidence, based, et cetera, et cetera. But we are going to have to understand who the expert is and is there an expert. And I think that's going to become more and more difficult to shout down, because as soon as I have a iPhone in a commercial gym, I am now an expert. And if I say, performance based or world class, or, it's just like natural flavors, whatever term you want to use for branding. And look, I understand, people want to get paid for doing the things they love, but it's going to be really difficult to understand. And AI is going to make that more difficult for sure. Who owns that? Does that get us what we want? Is it defining? Is, Hinge's new computer vision model that's not even based on having clinicians in the room anymore, is that a superior outcome to what we do when I put myself in front of someone who's been trained by Brent? That's going to be really, it's going to take a second, right?
It is. And that's where the transparency factor comes back in, right? How do we define what an expert is? Is it someone who's worked at a certain institution or holds certain credentials or has so many years of experience? How do we define that expert? And the other piece is, how is that expert, again, being transparent with what they do and why they do it, right? Because going back to the online piece, I think a lot of the stuff you see online is people who have tried something and it didn't work for them. The conventional model failed them. So then they went out and blazed their own trail forward. And, maybe it's a little bit chaotic what they did, and maybe it doesn't really fit the mold, but it worked for them. And because it worked for them, it must work for everyone else. So now we're going to spread that and preach that as gospel, right? I see the same thing in young PTs. So young PTs do it all the time, right? Like, I was probably guilty of it myself my first year out of school, right? You go out, you take a Con Ed course, you learn about the next greatest thing, and then you want to step back in the clinic and use that intervention with everyone you work with, right? Everyone's getting dry needling now because I just got certified and it's the greatest thing ever. Everyone's getting spine manipulation because I just learned about it and it's the greatest thing ever. When in reality, Brett, I know you've got all kinds of stuff to say about the biases and different things that way that exist in this, but in reality, we become a victim of our own kind of like lack of transparency with ourselves and with our patients in relation to what we're doing and why we're doing it.
That goes back to like what we were talking about at the beginning of this, where it's like you have to have the discipline to do your assessment, do your reassessment, and be comparing interventions based on objective outcomes, right?
That's right.
That's what it comes
That's right.
down to. One thing that people make the mistake of all the time is just because it worked doesn't mean it worked best. I could care less about what worked. I want optimal outcomes. There was that old phrase in training, I know Kelly, you'll remember this, where it's like, there's no such thing as a bad exercise. Bullshit. Yes, there is. A bad exercise is any exercise that wasted your time that you could have been doing an exercise that would have gotten you a better outcome. Like, there are plenty of horrible exercises out there that you should not be doing because you have a limited amount of time.
No. I got 2 hours in the gym to film my, as I work on my interosseous and strengthen those. I mean, you're really hitting at, how do we teach the highest expression of the movement? How do I work with the person in front of me, given the available resources? And right, what is best in that model? There's always a best in that model, and we should be working the rest of our lives towards what is best in that model.
That's it.
And I'll see you in 30 or 40 years. And what you'll see is that you probably can't practice by yourself. You can't be alone making these decisions. You probably need some brothers and sisters around you. And you need to get together and you need to talk about this and create networks and then be intensely curious. And when you see someone having good results, watch what's going on. You educate yourself. And really, when we said lifelong education, right? Curiosity of learning. I mean, this is what we meant, is that we shouldn't be practicing in the same way that we did 10 years ago because we have deeper understanding. In fact, what we've been able to do is jettison a lot of the time wasting. I think that's what's really powerful.
Yeah, I would definitely say that like the reason why I'm a better physical therapist now is not what I'm doing, it's what I'm not doing.
Oh my gosh. I mean, the three of us haven't even talked about a single technique. All we're doing is like, this is meta physical therapy.
Yeah,
You know
yeah.
what I mean? Like, and substitute the word chiro or osteo or medicine
Athletic
or
trainer.
it's the same. And, ultimately what I see is that it's becoming less important what school you came from and more important that you end up adopting a worldview that puts this objective measure out in front and that you are an outcome driven person. And that is the full stop. And maybe you get to stay with that person. I'm a credentialed physical therapist for Cal Berkeley. I work with all of their teams. I have 800 athletes. I work alongside all the athletic trainers. I really get to see how difficult a proposition is to keep kids healthy to do their jobs.
Oh, yeah.
And simultaneously, I'm also a strength coach. So I get to be in the weight room and I get to be on the pool deck and I get to be on the court side and I get to see all aspects of this thing, which really helps me make better decisions. Not this is how much control I have for these things and this, I got you for 45 minutes in this, hung ceiling carpeted, room where I had you laid on a table to talk about your running mechanics, right? I mean, that you can see how there are probably some gaps in my understanding.
Where do we make the transaction between that long-term optimal outcome and the long-term goals that we're after in the short-term performance side in the athletic space? Because Kelly, as you just kind of hit on, you work with hundreds of athletes, right? And a lot of them, they'll start moving a little different and they don't feel the same. And they might tell you like, well, I'm not as quick now, or my shot doesn't feel as powerful or whatever that way.
I don't have those problems, believe it or not.
You don't have those.
No. And I think it's actually a fallacy that when we give the body better access to its native ranges, it immediately has more movement solutions and more efficiency and economy in that. Because all the while that person is drilling skills on top of this. I think that, and I don't, push back, but that thinking sometimes came out of, well, I go work in my computer and then I come to your office and then I go work at my computer again. Right. And I had to use my hip. But one of the things that we do see, of course, you can definitely overdo it and make someone sore and the tissues have to adapt, et cetera, et cetera. But because I get to work alongside, Cy Young Award winners, world champions, starting pitchers, the NFL quarterbacks. What I don't ever do is change their technique. That is a conversation that's between them and their coaches. What I do is give the body not supernatural ranges of motion, native range of motion, right? The range that we all agree on. And I reinforce those with what they're going to do and how they're reinforcing those and keeping minimums in the gym. And when we do that, it doesn't change anything negatively. It only changes things positively. And we've even seen a model, I'll point to Altus Track and Field with Stuart McMillan, where they have a trackside therapy model where an athlete will sprint and then come lay on the table. They'll change something, mobilize something, input to something, and the athlete will sprint again. I mean, that's how tightly coupled these processes are. And so the real issue is that how do we, understand these outcomes in a more effective way? I never have to, like, someone isn't like, oh my God, now my hip works and I had to rebuild my swing. That's not how it works.
Yeah, I think, just to support what Kelly's saying here, it's like, I think you'd be really hard pressed to find an example of somebody who you got to move better and they were somehow worse.
Yeah.
Their sport. Like, I don't see it happen. I'm sure things are probabilistic. I'm sure we could find somebody that happened to. But I think what a lot of times happens, and this is going to sound pretty harsh, but because of that lack of discipline, because of the lack of continually going after an objectively measurable outcome, I hear a lot more of this. Well, I tried this intervention and they got worse. It's because that intervention didn't work and you don't have an objective outcome measure to show that it worked. So, all of a sudden you go, well, I activated the posterior oblique subsystem with a swing and their jump shot didn't get better. And you're like, yeah, because maybe that wasn't their problem. You didn't do any level of assessment. You just threw out a hypothesis. You didn't reassess anything. And I wouldn't use kettlebell swings to do that particular thing anyway, right? It's just not a very effective technique for that particular outcome measure that they were trying to go for.
And to just circle back up, we said objective measure. You remember I said range of motion and biomotor output? Did you throw the ball harder? Did you swim faster? Did you lift more weight? Those are things that I can measure. I do measure them. And I really want to be super clear that it's not, suddenly my shoulders hurt. Cool. We knew we were going to get ahead of that eventually anyway, right? Because that's not the thing we were chasing. The thing we were chasing is you don't know how to use your shoulder and don't have control, and you're having to create all these, let me tell you a story about an athlete who was a Cy Young Award winner, superstar, pitched in like World Series, missing internal rotation on the lead arm. So does not have any internal rotation. So guess what happens to compensate? Shoulder drives forward. As soon as that shoulder is forward, that completely changed what was going on with that throwing arm. And when we did two things, we just did some interventions to work on internal rotation of the hip in extension on the drag leg, right? And we gave him some internal rotation, and he didn't have to do this crazy looping. He didn't have to problem solve at this like genius level. He was just able to throw again. So I completely reverted his mechanics by doing two simple interventions that were predominantly driven by isometrics. The brain was like, oh, I can access this position again. And then that athlete went right back there and threw in the 90s again, signed another contract, won another World Series. And I didn't do anything except saying, hey, it seems like your shoulder doesn't do this. And it should go to 70, as we already talked about. So let's just get it to 70, and then let's see what happens.
I mean,
again, serial anecdotal empiricist here. That was just an example of an anecdote, but I just wanted to share it because that's my experience writ large.
There's so many like little things in there too. Like you didn't chase pain. You went after the movement dysfunction, not even necessarily on the side of the complaints, which happen all the time, right? Like how many low back patients have I addressed with fixing dorsiflexion or fixed Achilles tendinopathy on one side by getting dorsiflexion back on the other side?
Weird.
Like it's weird until you do it, right? And then you just go.
It's so obvious. You're like, okay, of course,
you're just
of
like,
course.
Yeah, right. That's kind of goes back to what we were talking about before of like, in a lot of ways, I'm a better therapist now because of what I'm not doing. Like,
that's right.
I'm not chasing pain. I'm not trying to do these crazy fancy techniques. I mean, I basically use static manual release techniques, joint manipulations and mobilizations, and activation techniques. Like these are the bread and butter of what I do. Occasionally some stretching, occasionally some other fancy technique, but like the bread and butter is like release, mobilize, activate, release, mobilize.
And who said the El Rancho gait wasn't useful? I mean, look at you. You just flashed that. You were like, look, you don't have any dorsiflexion and terminal stance. And I'm just kidding. I just wanted to throw out El Rancho gait because I had to memorize that and I still feel resentful.
If we had to go through all the things that I had to memorize that I feel resentful for, this would be the longest therapy session on the planet.
I love it. I love it. As we start to wrap up here, I mean, my main takeaways from the conversation so far is the best approach to physical therapy has to be outcome driven. And it's not something that involves chasing pain. You have to treat the underlying movement shapes, patterns, and dysfunctional movements, for lack of a better way to put it, that you see that way. And the more you go after those things, the better off you're going to be long term. And the more you cling to actual legitimate research and not just what pops up in your TikTok feed that morning, the better off you're going to be as a PT long term.
Yeah, agreed.
What is this person going to do for herself?
Yeah.
Self-management is a big thing. Yeah. Remembering, and we talked about this too, that accurate information is expensive. So if somebody is a blogger, you got to kind of take that into consideration as opposed to like following somebody who follows the research.
And I also want to just give a shout out to Brent because it's so difficult to systematize and organize and think critically about these things and reproduce that. There are geniuses out there one-on-one who can't tell you what the process is. It's intuitive, it's magical, it's, they get good outcomes, but they can't teach it to anyone else. And any good model just has to do three things. It has to explain current phenomenon, it has to predict future phenomenon, it has to be communicated to another person or another professional person. If you're working with something or someone or some model and you can't do those three things, can't explain why we use this technique to get this outcome in the shoulder, why we mobilize this or reinforce this, why, if you don't do this, why you're likely to move this or have problems in the future because we've run this experiment with human beings for a long time. And if Brent and I can't communicate about it, then one of us does not have a model.
I love that point. And as you mentioned, getting the legitimate, well thought out information might come at a price, but I think it's a lot easier when that price is in the form of a subscription where it's comparable to more of like a Netflix than like a $10,000 or more investment that way. And Brent, I know you are the expert at that. And Kelly, I know you have a number of online courses as well that way that really do a great job of kind of covering movement, mobility, and a lot of other considerations for coaches that way. Where can people find out more about the two of you? Where can they find out all of your online offerings and all of that sort of thing?
We are thereadystate.com, and our app is it's called Mobility Coach. And one of the things that I just want to highlight is that Brent and I both fully believe in trying to democratize this information. That is, trust us, it is not the right way to get rich. It is a really important worldview that that we believe that everyone should be able to have this on their phones, in their pocket, to work on themselves or in their own practices. And so everything is at The Ready State and thereadystate.com.
I can tell you I'm a big fan of The Ready State. Kelly, what you're doing is amazing. We've talked about this before. If I was better at talking to normal people, I would be more helpful as a coach to the general public, but I think a little too nerdy. So obviously the difference between the two of us is the audience we go after. You're trying to democratize it for everybody, which I think, like I said, if I wasn't doing what I'm doing, I would be trying to do what you do. Not to say that I would be good at it, but that I would be trying to do what you do. So obviously it's appreciated with the coaching program that you do. You can reach my stuff, obviously, is the brookbushinstitute.com or brookbushinstitute.com. We have 3 certifications and 180 plus courses now, all approved for continuing ed. And of course, we're on the side of trying to help professionals either add a credential or get their first credential if they're a personal trainer. And then, of course, get your CEs filled, which everybody has to get their continuing education credits. And obviously, we're like Netflix. You can do courses on your phone or whatever. And again, to that democratization piece, we just always go back to this thing of as a test case, how cool would it be if you could just be educating on taking courses on your commute, right? You're in the car, you pop in the headphones and you can get this course read to you as you're going through the text and look at the illustrations. And if we could all just get our education in downtime, how much more education could we do? Is kind of the question mark. So it's tough to do, but we're trying. And
let me say this. I want everyone to know I watch you on Instagram all the time, and I take your quizzes because I use it as a reminder as a clinician. Oh yeah, what was the intervention for that? Oh, what does that? It's such a great, I get to do micro re-education in just this really easy. I'm doom scrolling and I'm whoop, over here. And I will tell everyone, if I have a research need, I go to Brent and his staff. I just want everyone to know that you don't have to be an expert in research 24/7 because you actually have a job and a family. We have nerdy friends who are doing it for you. And I just want to point everyone there all the time. I just quoted you yesterday because, again, someone was like, oh, what about the special hip that I have? And I was like, hold up. Let me show you what my friends have done around looking at all of this and saying, is this evidence supported? So Brent, for me as a clinician and as just a, coach in the world, I go to your site, I read your thing, I take your tests all the time because I find it to be really useful to keep me sharp.
Yeah, there's a couple pieces there that you hit on that I think are super important, which is the idea that everybody should be able to know all the research is a total fallacy. We have a team working at all times, and it is taking us years to create conclusions completely built on all of the data available to just cover, at some level, just the basics of practice, right? There's always these odd cases where we're man, we don't even have time to address that odd case, right? And I think the other point that you make that's really important is it doesn't matter how smart you are. You can't keep all of it in your memory all the time, which is where things like quizzing and trying to take even just a course a month, right, is a big deal. Do I remember all of the specificity and sensitivity for all of the special tests? No. Do I forget origins and insertions sometimes, despite the fact that I've written all these courses? Sure. there is a lot of detail out there. And you just bring up a good point, Kelly, that like I think most people would respect the two of us as high quality clinicians. And we're both admitting that like by ourselves we couldn't get all the research
No.
to practice full time. The two of us, as smart as we might be, can't keep it all stored in our random access memory, like our forward memory all the time. Like it's just not even possible. You have to look stuff up. So
I mean, I'm looking stuff up every day, and I'm kind of not much compared to you two.
Stop
But
it.
if you're a boots on the ground kind of guy, you definitely got to be on the Brookbush Institute.
let's be careful with ChatGPT and Google. They're like, it's just
Awesome.
Again,
Well,
it's just reminding everyone, you want transparency, you want to see how people are thinking, you want to see what they're doing, and you want to actually see what it looks like where the rubber hits the road. We can have a lot, I got involved, just last thing I'll say is I got involved in an argument one time about foot position, and we didn't actually define our terms. We didn't actually demonstrate what we meant. And I was like, oh, lost opportunity. We're having an artificial conversation about very tactical things. And I missed the opportunity to ask someone explicitly, can you show me what you mean? So just keep that in mind. That's been a really important lesson for me.
guys, I really appreciate your time. We'll link to your websites, your social media, all that stuff in the description below. That way, if people didn't quite catch it, you can just click there. Thank you again for everything.
thank you, man.
Absolutely.